Welcome. Every human group, whether religious, political, or something else, has to define itself. What are its goals? What are its practices? How will it be organized? That is, who is in charge? Today we're looking at major developments in Christianity during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. We'll first analyze the developing relationship between Jews and Christians. Then we'll turn to how Christians, after the apostles, defined right belief. We'll conclude with the creation of Christian martyrs by the Roman state. It's probably impossible to overstate the impact of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Based upon the Hebrew scriptures, Jews believed that God had directed Moses to build a tabernacle in the wilderness, and the temple was based upon the tabernacle's pattern. The temple thus stood at the center of Jewish religious practice. The New Testament tells us that Jesus was a pilgrim to Jerusalem, that he went to the temple. And because Christians were originally Jews, they maintained the same beliefs and practices. In the temple, worship, which included rituals, was led by priests. The technical term here is liturgy. That is, the set order and rituals in a worship service. Some of those rituals might seem strange to us today, notably animal sacrifice. But in fact, animal sacrifice was quite standard among not just Jews, but the Romans and other groups as well. The ending of animal sacrifice is, in part, due to the growth of Christianity. But liturgy continued on in the early church. In fact, it was only in the 16th century that some Protestants began rejecting liturgy. Of course, some Protestants retained liturgy, but if we look at Christianity on a global basis, we find that liturgy is the norm still today. The New Testament indicates that the earliest Christians did not associate Jesus' death with the end of sacrifice or worship in the temple. Several stories in the book of Acts show this. First, Christians continued to worship in the temple after Jesus' death and resurrection. In the 2nd chapter of Acts, we read, "Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home." This was also true of the Apostle Paul's ministry. Shortly before Acts concludes, we read that Paul continued to worship in the temple and even offered sacrifice there. He says, "I came to bring alms to my nation and to offer sacrifices." But a change did develop among the first Christians, and we see this also in the New Testament. We can't date the books of the New Testament with precision, but we can look at how they spoke of the temple. Some works, such as the letter to the Hebrews and the Apocalypse or Revelation of John, speak of the temple in a spiritual fashion. This is because these books were probably written after the temple had been destroyed. And although they retained temple imagery, they also changed it by transferring the work of the temple priesthood to Jesus. Nonetheless, the temple has a central place in the New Testament. But quite regrettably, we don't have any surviving evidence that tells us how Christians at the time responded to the catastrophe of the temple's destruction in the year 70. How did other Jewish groups respond? Some ancient Jewish texts can shed much light on this question. One such work is the 2nd book of Esdras. The name Esdras is just the Greek form of Ezra, who was a prophet in ancient Israel. This work is not part of the Jewish scriptures today, but it has floated in and out of Christian Bibles. As a brief digression, here's a fun fact. 2nd Esdras was in Christopher Columbus's Bible. There's a passage in 2nd Esdras which says that God made the earth 6 parts land and a 7th part water. Columbus used this as part of his justification for arguing that there was a shortcut to the Indies. But 2nd Esdras also reveals the sorrow felt by Jews in the late 1st century. Like the revelation of John, 2nd Esdras compares Rome to the ancient city of Babylon. The author laments, "It would have been better for us not to be here than to come here and live in ungodliness, and to suffer and not understand why. Josephus believed that God allowed the temple to be destroyed as divine judgment against militant religious extremists, but the author of 2nd Esdras wasn't so sure. Religious and political militancy are dangerous, in part because they aim at victory, and when victory is not achieved, their frustrated ambitions still remain. In the year 132, another Jewish revolt was launched against the Romans. Its leader was Simon Bar Kokhba, or as his followers called him, Bar Kokhba, a messianic title that means son of the star. Remarkably, the Bar Kokhba revolt was successful for 3 years. During that time, the revolutionaries succeeded in creating their own form of currency, and few things indicate independence as clearly as socio-economic independence. We see this here. The coins show the temple, and Bar Kokhba and his supporters intended to rebuild it. But like the revolt launched in the late 1st century, the revolt of Bar Kokhba also failed. Regrettably, we know nothing about contemporary Christian responses to Bar Kokhba. A much later tradition from the 4th century says that Christians refused to participate in his revolt. However, although it may be true, because this tradition is from hundreds of years later, it can't be corroborated. But there is a Christian apocalyptic work, known as the Apocalypse of Peter, which may offer us some insight into how Christians perceived Bar Kokhba at the time. The Apocalypse of Peter contains a very interesting discussion of a false Messiah, which is given amidst a parable told about a fig tree. When its boughs have sprouted at the end of the world, then shall deceiving Christ come, and awaken hope with the words, I am the Christ, who is now come into the world. But this deceiver is not the Christ, and when they reject him, he will kill with the sword, and there shall be many martyrs. Was this about Bar Kokhba? It certainly dates from the general time period, although it's hard to know for sure. The Apocalypse of Peter is not generally regarded as Christian scripture. The one exception is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which has long included the work as part of its New Testament. Later in the 2nd century, we have the first recorded Christian views on the destruction of the temple. Justin Martyr, a 2nd century Christian philosopher and martyr, left behind several works, including one entitled The Dialogue with Trypho. Trypho was a Jew, and the dialogue shows us 2 important things. First, it contains passing references to Bar Kokhba torturing Christians who would not support his revolt. Second, it shows that some 2nd century Christians connected Jewish political failures with rejecting Jesus as the Messiah. For example, Justin Martyr believed that Bar Kokhba lost his revolt due to false messianic ambitions. More broadly, Justin Martyr believed that the temple was destroyed for the same reason, because Jews had not accepted Jesus as the Messiah. And over the next century, this became the standard Christian interpretation. It, in turn, gave rise to a theological view generally known as Supersessionism. This is the view that Christians have replaced Jews as the people of God. But Christians also had their own internal arguments. Today, Orthodoxy is generally taken to mean right belief, but it originally pertained to matters of reverence as well. So, we might say that Orthodoxy is about 2 things: having the correct judgment or belief on a matter, and having the right estimation of something, that is, showing reverence in the right way. The opposite of orthodoxy is heresy. The word heresy did not, however, originally mean wrong belief. Rather, it pertained to opinion. It literally meant a school of thought. In the most general sense, every belief system is a heresy, that is, a school of thought. But in the early church, diverse schools of thought came to be contrasted with orthodoxy. The main group of 2nd century heretics was, in fact, a group of groups. The term Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. At some point in the 2nd century, some Christians came to believe that they had secret, mystical knowledge. They further claimed that salvation depended upon receiving this knowledge. From their perspective, standard Christian practices, repentance, baptism, communion, etc., were not enough. Our knowledge of Gnostics comes from 2 main sources. First, is the writings of those who oppose the Gnostics. This creates some problem of interpretation because the accuracy of these polemics is not entirely clear. Second, in 1945, a small collection of Gnostic documents was discovered in Egypt. Some were largely intact, but others merely fragments. So today it's actually quite difficult to piece together Gnostic beliefs and practices. But it is clear the Gnostics were generally quite hostile to Jews and Judaism. Some went so far as to claim that the God of Christians was different than the God of ancient Israel. Consequently, some Gnostics completely rejected the Hebrew Scriptures, that is, of those writings that Christians today call the Old Testament. A good example of this comes from a work entitled The Apocryphon of John. The word apocryphon literally means hidden or secret. So, according to this text, the Apostle John had a secret message that was transmitted only in Gnostic circles. The anti-Jewish element is key in the Apocryphon of John. Throughout the work we read a simple refrain, "It is not as Moses said." That is, the book of Genesis, the first book of the Hebrew Scriptures, is wrong. In the Apocryphon of John, these words are attributed to Jesus himself. According to Genesis, God created humanity. But according to the Apocryphon of John, humanity was created by a lesser deity. According to Genesis, God blessed creation, but according to the Apocryphon of John, creation was not blessed. Rather, creation was inherently bad. This is very different than in the book of Genesis. In it, creation is blessed by God, and although fallen, it still points to its divine author. But Gnostics rejected this idea entirely. The debate with Gnostics led to an important development among 2nd century Christians. We find an increased use of the word Catholic to describe Orthodox belief. This is not quite the same as the modern term Roman Catholic, although there are significant connections. The Greek word katholikos means universal. One of the earliest uses of the word Catholic comes from the letters of Ignatius of Antioch. He points to several things all at once: communion, that is the Eucharist, as well as church order and universal belief. He writes, "Only that Eucharist, which is under the authority of the bishop, is to be considered valid. Wherever the bishop appears, there let the congregation be, just as wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church." This also points back to the New Testament emphasis on unity. The argument was that a universal belief is a shared and unified belief. Truth is, by definition, one, but error is many. Between the early 2nd and early 3rd centuries, a growing number of Christians called themselves Catholic to indicate their acceptance of a universal faith shared by all other Christians. The universal faith was a unified faith, and it stood against the diverse errors of diverse groups, such as the Gnostics. Ignatius's letter also points to something else: the existence of a church order predicated on a threefold hierarchy. This hierarchy consists of bishops, priests, and deacons. Most churches are still organized this way today. At the top was the bishop, or in Greek, the episkopos. The bishop oversaw all the churches in a given area, including the teaching and worship in them. Below the bishop was the presbyter. The Greek word presbyter is the origin of the English word priest. The priest led worship, preached, and presided over rituals such as baptism and communion. Below the presbyters were the deacons. They helped organize various forms of charitable service within the church, but also for the wider world. And they assisted the priests during worship. Catholic Christians developed two key assumptions about this hierarchy. First, the bishop was said to be the successor of the apostles. That is, he was tasked with maintaining the purity of the faith. Furthermore, the unity of this universal Catholic faith was taken to signify that the teaching of bishops originated ultimately with the apostles, and therefore that it was orthodox. These two beliefs are together called apostolic succession. By the late 2nd century, around the year 180, Irenaeus of Lyon, a bishop in what is now modern-day France, published two important works. The first was entitled On the Apostolic Preaching. It argued that Catholic Christians were the true Christians and faithful to the apostles. The second work was entitled Against All Heresies. This was a detailed refutation of various Gnostic ideas and texts. Importantly, Irenaeus quoted most of the books now found in the Christian Bible. So, unlike the Gnostics, he accepted the Hebrew Scriptures, which Christians today call the Old Testament. Furthermore, Irenaeus is our oldest textual source for the Christian belief in only 4 Gospels, that is, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of which are today in the Christian Bible. Finally, Irenaeus offers a vivid illustration of Catholic Christians' belief in apostolic succession. He tells his readers that he learned about Christianity and that he was ordained by the early 2nd century Christian leader and martyr Polycarp. Irenaeus then tells us that Polycarp was ordained by the Apostle John. So, Irenaeus' argument is that you can trust him because his teaching goes ultimately back to one of Jesus' original followers. We conclude by looking at the earliest Christian martyrs. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christians suffered occasional rounds of persecution. Today, the word martyr denotes someone who suffers for their belief, but originally, the word martyr simply meant witness. The influence of Christianity has been so great in Western cultures that the Christian experience of martyrdom effectively redefined the Greek word. Despite assumptions to the contrary, Romans were not especially open-minded towards new religions. The first major wave of persecution began under the Emperor Nero. Martyrs were seen as imitating Christ. Some even prayed for their persecutors just like Jesus did. But they were also described with a range of biblical images, incense, the bread and wine of communion, and sacrifice more generally. But Christian ideas about martyrdom also had Jewish roots. This shows a story of martyrdom from the book of 2nd Maccabees. This work is not part of the Jewish or Protestant Bibles, but it is found in Catholic, Orthodox, and ecumenical Christian Bibles. The story of the Maccabees details the origins of Hanukkah. About 200 years before Christ, the temple in Jerusalem was desecrated by a Greek ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes IV. The Maccabee brothers then launched a rebellion to free their land from this pagan dictator. They succeeded and reconsecrated the temple, but not before Antiochus Epiphanes martyred Jews who refused to renounce their faith. Hanukkah celebrates the reconsecration of the temple, and it also commemorates the Jewish martyrs of that time. Christians later commemorated Christian martyrs. In this, they followed Jewish precedent. Martyrdom did not have its intended effect. On the one hand, among Christians, the experience of persecution helped create cohesion and identity. On the other hand, although some Romans enjoyed the spectacle of Christians being killed, other Romans found it unjust. Some Romans further admired the bravery of the martyrs in the face of death. Consequently, martyrdom did not terrorize Christianity out of existence. Rather, it helped the church grow. In the words of Tertullian, a 3rd century Christian from North Africa, the blood of the martyrs is seed. That is, martyrdom helped grow the church. But why did the Romans want to persecute Christians? It might sound strange, but we need to try and step into what is sometimes called the piety of the persecutors. The Romans had reasons that made sense, at least to many Romans. In other words, persecution is not arbitrary. Persecution happens for a reason, and this is true not just of the ancient Romans, but of later Christian history too. When Christians later persecuted Jews or other Christians, they had reasons for doing so. I do not mean to excuse such actions, but to point out that, although horrible, we have to understand those reasons. Condemnation does not aid historical understanding. Christians were seen as a political threat. Romans were concerned to maintain Roman religious practices, but because Christians would not participate in Roman religion, many, if not most Romans, feared retribution by the Roman gods. Consequently, Christians were derided as atheists, that is, those who were without the Roman gods. In order to get a handle on this perceived threat, the Romans persecuted Christians. and the Romans also burned Christian books. Book burning was pursued by the censores. The Latin original gives us English words such as censor and censorship. The censores sought to maintain public morals through burning controversial materials. And Christian texts, including but not limited to biblical texts, were certainly controversial. So what? Martyrdom led to an important development within Christianity, and here we might try to do a little bit of myth-busting. Despite popular assumptions to the contrary, the earliest Christian saints were not taken out of pagan religious practice. Rather, the earliest Christian saints were Christian martyrs. The Greek text of the New Testament makes this clear. In the Revelation of John, also known as the Apocalypse, we read of saints and martyrs. Revelation chapter 6 talks about the martyrs in the language of sacrifice, and these same martyrs are called hagioi. The Greek word hagioi was translated into Latin as sancti, and this gives us the English word saints. Quite unlike the practice of Roman religion, Christians treated the bodies of their dead with great reverence. This was especially true of the martyrs. In Roman custom, the bodies of the dead were thrown outside the city walls. This enacted in dramatic form a permanent separation between the living and the dead. But among Christians, the bodies of the dead, and especially martyrs, were not only buried within the city walls, but within churches themselves. And this enacted, in dramatic form, the intimate connection between living Christians and their righteous dead. Furthermore, martyrs were named and remembered in corporate worship. Eventually, days were set aside for such remembrance. So the Christian approach to the dead was very different than the Roman approach. In fact, the two approaches were opposite one another. Few things were as un-Roman and un-pagan as Christian reverence for the hagioi, the righteous dead, the saints. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. There are many excellent works on the long, slow, and sometimes haphazard separation of Judaism and Christianity. A good starting point for the topic is James D.G. Dunn's The Partings of the Ways, between Christianity and Judaism and their significance for the character of Christianity. Dunn's work is, quite rightly, a classic and has influenced a number of other studies on the same topic. For the early Christian response to Gnosticism, the best place to start is probably with Irenaeus of Lyon. His short work on the apostolic preaching lays out his main arguments concerning Christian orthodoxy. Finally, one of the best insights into martyrdom comes from Robert Louis Wilkins' work, The Christians as the Romans Saw Them, a now classic study that offers a panoramic portrayal of why the Romans considered Christianity a threat. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.